Thank you to the organizing committee. It's a pleasure to be here, and the choice of discussant is just perfect. I want to highlight that my two co-authors are here, and Hidehiko is not only in Japan now, but awake. Okay, so let's start with the presentation. So what we know already from the literature that sudden stop, these big financial crises that are characterized by reversal in the financial flows, are characterized by persistent cost in terms of output for these countries. And we have already discussed that these losses in output could be attributed to decreases in productivity. Now, we have made progress in the literature, and we have understood that distortions in the dynamics of firms could account for these losses in productivity. Why is that? Well, because at the end of the day, productivity is the ability to do things, and those the actors that are doing things are firms. So if they can come up with new technologies or adopt better ways of production, that would trigger improves in productivity. And if the crisis affects the ability to do those activities, then you're going to get this crisis. Now, these losses in productivity. Now, one thing that we haven't discussed, and is in some sense what the goal of this paper is that sudden stop are also characterized by strong movement in the real exchange. And these movements typically imply more favorable conditions for exporters. At the same time, we know that exporters are very productive firms, and we also know that whenever a given firm introduces a new product to the exporting market, they typically gain in terms of productivity. So what we're going to do here is to bridge all these literatures. We're going to have a unified model that is going to have endogenous sudden stops. On top of that, we're going to get endogenous decisions for trading, and we're going to understand the effect that the sudden stop has in productivity, recognizing that it might foster exporting decisions from firms in the domestic economy. So basically, what are the questions that we're going to answer today? We are going to study the role of exporters in aggregate productivity dynamics during sudden stops. And in order to do that, empirically and from the model perspective, we're going to look at the product portfolios of firms. So we're going to have firms that are going to export some of their products, or all of their products, or none of their products. So an exporter is not going to be just a 1-0 dummy in this model and in the data. So the paper, as I was telling you, composes a novel quantitative model. This is a framework that is going to have endogenous financial crisis, think of Mendoza 2010. It's going to have endogenous productivity and firm dynamics, like the paper that we wrote with Sina. But at the same time, and this is the most novel part, we're going to have endogenous entry and exit into exporting at the product level. And this is going to be important because a lot of the models that we have used for endogenous productivity are models that are written at the product level, but there is no product data to validate or to study those models. Well, that's where the Chilean data comes handy. So a lot of countries have data in terms of trade for the product level, but what you cannot see for many countries is the composition of the portfolio between domestic products and exported products at the firm level. Chile has that data. And this is the data that we're going to leverage. And on top of the data, Chile has a sudden stop that is basically exogenous to them in 98. So what we're going to use is we're going to use this sudden stop as an experiment and the richness of this portfolio of product at the firm level to understand how firms decide to enter the domestic market at the product level and to enter the external market at the product level. We're going to learn several things from this framework and from the data. We're going to learn that the collapse comes from the domestic end. So when we see the productivity in terms of the endogenous part collapsing, it's mostly due to decreasing the entry to the domestic market. But the recovery is going to be speed up by the decisions of exporters because they are going to take advantage of the depreciated exchange rate that follows this crisis. We're going to see that if you completely ignore these product dynamics, you will be underestimated the welfare cost of the sudden stop by 30%. And we're going to do further decompositions if the time allows by the end. So let me go very quickly in terms of the literature. Basically, here we're bridging three literatures. First, the literature of sudden stop with endogenous crisis. Think about the Fisherian deflation mechanism that we discussed yesterday. We are also bridging this literature with the literature that has incorporated endogenous growth into international real business cycle models. We have prominent exponents here of both literatures. What we're missing a little bit is the third part of the literature, which is the idea that trade and productivity interact, and that during crisis, you are going to get that the incentives to innovate and to export are going to be completely different. So you could think that what we're doing is combining these three literatures. You're going to see that the international finance part of the paper looks like Mendoza 2010. The firm dynamics and endogenous growth is going to be an extension of my paper with Sina, similar also to things that Hidehiko did in his job market paper. But then what we're going to bring is the new vein of endogenous growth model that allow for trade within them. If you want to think about the contribution, one contribution is the model. This framework doesn't exist, and now we're going to show you that it's quite tractable given its complexity. But another big contribution is the data. I'm going to show you product level evidence, and I'm going to match it to the data. And this is going to be interesting from the science perspective, but also a contribution to the endogenous growth literature, because as I was telling you, nobody has contrasted product level data with models of innovation at the product level. So let me give you a very quick overview of the model. The model, as Carlos and Ricardo can tell you, is a little bit complex. So I'm going to tell you what the main agents of the model are, and then I'm going to dig deeper only in the parts that are more novel in terms of the model. So this is a small open economy model. From the small open economy perspective, we're going to look at these three agents. So let's start with the domestic final good producer. So the domestic final good producer is going to do all the international borrowing. So this is going to be similar to the discussion that we had before in terms of the sovereign default literature. We're going to concentrate intertemporal decisions in one agent. In this case, it's going to be the domestic final good producer. Because he's going to use as a discount factor of the household, that's not going to be very important. This final good producer is going to do the international borrowing. It's going to be subject to the collateral constraint in the spirit of Mendoza 2010, and it's going to manage the fixed asset, which is the one that determines the endogenous borrowing constraint. That fixed asset is going to be rented to the domestic intermediate producers. The domestic intermediate producers are the ones where endogenous growth and firm dynamics take a part. So this guy is representative, the domestic final good producer, but the domestic intermediate producer are continuum, and they are all heterogeneous. And here, a firm is going to be a collection of product lines. And at each product line, they can decide to export. In that sense, they will be selling to the foreign market or to keep domestic. The thing is that they can also lose competitiveness, and you could get replaced by a foreign intermediary. And if you get replaced now, that good is not domestically produced, but imported. So at the end here, what you're going to get is some firms are going to be domestic, some firms are going to be domestic and exporting, and some firms are going to not be there because we're going to be importing those varieties from the rest of the world. That's basically the main thing that we have to discuss. So I'm going to show you first the domestic financial producer and how the endogenous borrowing constraint is going to be affecting the demand for this for the domestic final good. And then I'm going to show you how that relates to the domestic intermediate production. So let's start with the production function. The production function is going to be characterized by an exogenous productivity shock, your typical TFP shock. And we're going to have an aggregator of intermediate varieties. So what you have here is an aggregator of all the intermediate varieties in the economy. This is basically an extension just of a Cobb-Douglas function where you're aggregating all these varieties. We're going to be subject to an occasionally binding borrowing constraint. So of course, we're solving this model with global methods, where basically the borrowing of the final good producer and the working capital constraint, because you have to pay in advance a fraction of the intermediate inputs, are going to be constrained by the amount of the fixed asset, this land, let's say, that is also used in production, that you're going to be needing. As we discussed yesterday, this is a Fisherian deflation model because you have the price of the asset this period that appears there in the constraint. What is important here is that you can derive the demand for the intermediate good production. The demand of the intermediate good production is going to be given by, of course, the price of the intermediate good, the aggregate scale of the economy, but you're going to have the multipliers. So now, whenever the constraint bind and the multiplier mu is positive, you're going to get a contraction in the demand. That contraction in the demand is going to affect the intermediate good producers. which is the part that we're going to discuss now. So let me first do a nice exposition with a drawing of the intermediate good producer so that you understand what is a firm, what are product lines, because all these parts sometimes get a little bit confusing. So imagine that we have here a unit of intermediate goods. Each of these goods are differentiated and they're going to be produced in equilibrium by only one firm. Now, what is a firm? A firm is going to be a collection of goods. For example, this firm is producing two goods, good A1 and good A2. What is the main heterogeneity across these goods? The first heterogeneity dimension is going to be productivity. So some of the goods you have been able to reach a high level of productivity, for others you have a low level of productivity. Each of the goods is going to be produced by the leader. The leader is going to be the firm that has the highest productivity for a given product. Now, what are the dynamics in this model? So the first type of dynamic that you can have is that firm one that used to sell this product only domestically is able to invest, increase productivity, and that increase in productivity is high enough that allows them to access the external market and start exporting. So this is a within product innovation where you have a domestic product and you decide to start exporting that product. So from this perspective, you first start producing domestically and then you export. We're going to have direct entry to export in a moment. So that's the first type of change that you can have on a firm. But it could also occur that firm one decides to expand. So they try to steal a product from another firm. And basically what they do is external innovation. And this product three that used to be produced by firm two is now produced by firm one. So basically now firm one also increased the productivity of this product. That's why she's able to outprice the former producer. And now this product is part of the portfolio of firm one. Firm two has shrunk, firm one has expanded, firm dynamics. Now, other kind of dynamics that we can have is exactly what we were discussing before. It could be the case that firm two, in one of its products that is being exporting, suddenly gets outpriced in the foreign market because a foreign firm is able to make an innovation in exactly this technology. In that respect, what you get is that now this firm becomes only domestically. There is no loss in productivity. I can still do what I was doing as well as I was doing it before. It's just that now I have lost the foreign market. And I become again a domestic producer for that particular product. What happened with the product line? Now it is important. It doesn't belong to any domestic firm. It belongs to a foreign firm. The other thing that could happen is direct entry. And we're going to have direct entry into exports. So for example, a firm was very lucky and was able to start directly exporting. Why is that? Because in the data, we see these kind of transitions. And we're going to have also direct entry into domestic. And that's basically all the firm dynamic that you have. If I stop here, you would say, how can they solve? There is a lot of heterogeneity. You have all these different status, and you have also these different levels of productivity. This is where a little bit of math is very illustrative. So the advantage of this framework is that although you have these two layers of heterogeneity, the heterogeneity in productivity can be summarized just by the status of the firm. So it's enough for us to know if a firm is exporting a product, or if that product is important, or if it's only produced domestically. And why is that? Well, that's exactly what I want to show you now. So the production of these intermediate varieties is going to use a Cobb-Douglas production functions on land and labor, H for hours, and the productivity that we already discussed how it evolved endogenously due to the innovation. So you could think of what are the profits for a given product. The profit is going to be the demand times the price minus the marginal cost. But we just derived the demand. The demand was this. So we can actually write it there. Now, given that, I can take this price and multiply it inside. So I get a 1, and then I get the ratio of the marginal cost over the price. The interesting thing is that now if we assume Bertrand monopolistic competition, and you remember the old days when you were studying this in college, what a Bertrand monopolistic does, it sets as price the marginal cost of the follower. And the difference in productivity is given by the step size. So basically, you're setting the price as the marginal cost, your marginal cost, plus the markup of your productivity gain because of being the leader. What that buys you is that the level of the particular product line is gone. And the only thing that matters is the step size. If this product line is exported, if it is domestic, or in this case, if it is imported. So it's a sufficient statistic for the whole distribution to know the share of product on each status. That's the basic advantage of this. And you end up getting this expression for the profits. This expression here is for the domestic profits. But we can do a similar algebra to get to an expression for the exporting profit. This is the part that is interesting, because when you export, you're going to be competing with the foreign producer. And the big difference there is that your marginal cost is in local factors, prices. But the marginal cost of the foreigner in this small open economy is taken as given. So now prices matter. Here, local prices don't matter because it affects you and your competitor in the same way. But here, the relative marginal cost, the relative prices between the two economies are key to determine your profits. This is where understanding export is critical, because in other models of innovation, without having exports, you miss these two dimensions that are novel in this model. The first thing is that sudden stop directly affect domestic demand, but domestic demand is not affecting exporters. The domestic demand hasn't had a sudden stop. And the second is that the sudden stop generates a crisis in the economy. That crisis is going to make labor crash. When labor crashes and the marginal cost decreases, you're going to get competitiveness with respect to the foreigners. And therefore, the prices of the exporting goods are going to increase. So what you're going to get during the sudden stop is this opposite movement. Domestic profits are going to go down, but exporting profits are going to go up. So now firms are going to adapt their portfolio of innovation, and they're going to go away from domestic innovation and move into exporting innovation. Those kind of dynamics are novel. We're going to document them in the data, and we're going to show you that they matter to understand the productivity effects of sudden stops. In terms of innovation, there are more details in the paper, but basically it's exactly what you would imagine. There is a cost function for an arrival rate of an innovation, and the marginal cost of that should be exactly the same as the marginal revenue. So in the margin, if you put 1 unit into innovating in the domestic products, you're going to get with this marginal probability an extra line, and this is the value of owning a domestic product. The same thing happens for the exporting innovation. So there are more details there in the paper, but this is what we mean that it is endogenous. There is actually a maximization done that equates marginal cost with marginal revenue. Let me show you how all these firm level dynamics get aggregated into overall productivity in the economy. So this is the same production function that I showed you before. If you do some algebra, which in fact is a lot of algebra that you can see in the appendix, you can write this as the following. And if you see, this is very close to your typical international real business cycle model. This is the total labor in the economy that is used in production. This is the total fixed asset that is used in production. And what is all this? All this would be productivity. Now, there is an exogenous productivity shock, just like your RBC model. Then there is a set of constants that are going on, and there is this productivity index. This productivity index is in fact the aggregation of all the individual productivities at the product level. And how are they evolving? Well, they are evolving endogenously through domestic innovation, exporting innovation, and the fact that foreigners can replace you. Because of course, when a foreigner replaces you, you can still produce more at a lower cost. The problem is that you have to pay that back with the trade balance. But at the end of the day, there are gains in productivity by being able to do the same thing at a lower cost. That's the only thing that innovation means in this model. So this is what I was meaning, that of course it's very nice to import products, but when you import products, you have to pay them intertemporally, either through the trade balance or to the current account. So that's basically how this model flows. Trade balance are endogenous, the current account is endogenous, and there's going to be second shock that I haven't discussed before, which is the interest rate shock. So in that sense, this is very close to Mendoza 2010. So this was a very quick exposition of a very complex model. So it's okay if you're a little bit confused. Carlos and Ricardo are going to finish the job. So Chile as an application. Why Chile? First, it's a small open economy, and we have this plant level data from Orenia. We have seen already this plant level data. Yesterday, Sophia showed us a beautiful paper using this data. What is the advantage that we have here is that there are some forms that we didn't have access before, but Felipe Benguria has the access to those, and the central bank now does too. You have the product level data at the firm level, not only of the exports, but also of the domestic production. So we know the whole portfolio of the firm in terms of how much they are selling abroad and how much they are selling here. And we can see those transitions. The limit is that the data that we have is only for 96 to 99. The good thing is that the sudden stop is in August of 98. So we can still compare the years before to the year after. And that's exactly what we're going to do to validate the model. Let me go a little bit quick because we don't have that much time. Let me just tell you that the externally calibrated parameters are very close to the Mendoza 2010 and all the literature. There's nothing really exotic going on there. The parameters that are more interesting are the ones that are internally calibrated, that come from the models of endogenous growth. And this is what I was telling you, that this is the first time that moments that are written at the product level are used to calibrate the model of innovation. So for instance, the model targets the share of products the share of non-exporters that have only one product. This is something that you typically don't see. Papers before would equate plants to products. If you know the ENIA, 98% of the plants in Chile are single plants. So there's everybody will have one product. But instead of that, in this data, on average, this firm have 4 products. So you lose all that heterogeneity by thinking about plants and not at the product level. So that's the calibration. Now I'm going to show you the validation of the calibration using the product level data. So only some moments of the product were used to calibrate the model, but none of these regressions that I'm going to show you were used to put this in the model. The first thing that I want to look at is this relationship between the number of products that you have and the probability of winning or losing products. In the model, that relationship is natural because the more products you have, the more you can innovate. But also, the more you can be replaced because you have more open fronts to be replaced. The question is that true in the data? And interesting, the answer is yes. So basically what you have here is the data, what you have here is the model, and you see that the more product you have, the more likely it is that you're gonna experience a transition from a product that you have never produced before to start producing it and sell it domestically. The same for all of the other transitions. So details on this on the paper, but this is not targeted and we were very happy with this. This is the transition in normal times. This is the firm distribution, also non-targeted. Only this first part here was targeted that I show you, the share of non-exporters with one product, but this is the whole distribution of products. And the model in the balanced growth path matches very well the size distribution of exporter and non-exporters at the product level. This was a surprise, and some courtrooms should be very happy about this. Now, let me show you the sign-stop dynamics. So this is what I was discussing before when I was telling you that there is a real exchange rate effect. What is the real exchange rate effect? It's a relative marginal cost. So basically here you have your typical graph where you track the sign stop some periods before and some period after. This is the period of the sign stop. And what you get is that the wages crash. That is going to drive down the relative marginal cost. So you're going to get an advantage as an exporter. And then the profits of today being an exporter are going to skyrocket. And the profit of being a domestic producer are going to crash because basically now the demand is tanking, the domestic demand is tanking. These two movements in opposite direction are going to affect the expected value of being an exporter or a domestic. And that is going to change the product portfolio decision of firms. So now what we can do is to look if that is also the case in the data. So here what we do is we compare the sign stop years to the years before the sign stop. And what do you see? That the probability for a firm to start selling a product that they have never sold before domestically decreases. And the probability of starting exporting something that they have never exported before decreases. But the probability of doing it domestically decreases much more than the probability of exporting. The same pattern is true in the model. So basically, this fact that you start relatively tilting during the crisis your market toward exporting products instead of selling them domestically. We also have results at the firm level. So basically what we see here, for example, is that it should be the case that exporters do better. It should be the case that exporters do better during the sign stop because of the effect that we have discussed. The nice thing about this data is that we can qualify an exporter, let's say, by somebody that exports at least one product. And then we can compare, for example, in terms of revenue and profits, how they do during the sign stop and before the sign stop. And you see that relatively to non-exporters, exporters do better in terms of revenue and profits and even the magnitudes are very close to what we find in the model. Now, let me take a more liberal view of the model. You could think that this is, for example, an industry. And then you could think that the level of the collateral constraint is going to depend on different industries. Because, for example, one industry needs much more working capital than another. So here, if that's the case, what we should see is that the effect of exporters doing better during the time stop should be more pronounced, the bigger is the collateral constraint of that industry. And in that respect, if we take the Rajan-Singales measure of financial dependence, what you would expect is that this triple interaction is positive, and that's exactly what's going on. So we see this as a validation that the channel that is helping the exporters is linked to this need for finance or to this working capital pattern.
5 minutes.
Yes. So let me show you. I have 3 more slides. How many minutes did you say, Rosanna?
5 minutes left.
Okay, that's perfect. I'm on time. So here what I want to show you is the productivity loss associated to the sand stock. So imagine an economy where there was no sand stock. Then you would be on your balanced growth path, and this would be the level of the productivity index that we were discussing. Now, in an economy where you have the full impact of the sand stock, so our baseline economy, this productivity index that marks the endogenous productivity part of the model is going to crash, and then it's going to recover, and slowly it's going to go back to where it should be. So this is the persistent effect of the sand stock that's coming from the endogenous productivity dynamics. Now, what we could do is to say what happened if we do a contrafactual where, for example, there is no effect of the sand stock on domestic innovation. So if you remember, for example, this big equation here that I show you, now that I have a little bit of time, I can do this. What I can do is to set these components to their balanced growth path, saying, for example, I'm going to leave the domestic innovation constant, I'm going to see what happens with the export, or I'm going to do the opposite here. And then what we can see is what I was telling you at the beginning. So basically on impact, the blue line and the black lines are practically the same. So most of the effect on impact is coming from domestic innovation. And of course, because that's the one that is tanking, the exporters are happy. So most of the effect on impact is coming from them. But now, if you shut off the exporter innovation, what you end up getting is that you never recover, and you recover very slowly. Because the recovery is coming from the fact that these guys are taking advantage of the relative marginal cost and trying to export as much as possible, and they are the more productive, and they are the ones that help you coming back and driving back the productivity. So we can use compensating variation for welfare. This is similar to what Enrique has done in some of his paper, which is the idea of saying how much this period you would pay to avoid the sand stock as a fraction of consumption. So the total cost of the sand stock is this number here. Now, imagine that you forget about endogenous productivity. You say, you know what, I like the exogenous shocks, I like Mendoza 2010, let's forget about all these mechanics and set all that to the balance growth path. What would have been the cost of the sand stock? Well, 70% of what it is. So on top of missing the persistent part of the recovery, that in those models the recovery is very quick, in this case the recovery is very protracted, you would be underestimating the welfare effects by 30%. Now, what about the decomposition between domestic innovation and exporting innovation? So this part is very interesting, because if there is no effect of the domestic innovation, that means that the cost is going to be 75% instead of this 70%. But the really big effect is coming from shutting down the exporting innovation. So here is where you see that exporters are the ones that are shielding the economy. The exporters alone would make you, in fact, be better off. But the point is that if you miss them, only the effect of the domestic would be even higher. So this is the shielding effect of the exporting innovation that is completely ignored, for example, in my paper with CINA, or all of the paper that we have seen of sand stock with endogenous growth. So let me conclude. What we have shown you today is a unified framework that has endogenous sand stock, as in Mendoza 2010, endogenous trade decisions at the product level, and those trade decisions are linked to endogenous growth. We have calibrated this classic model for the first time to product level data, we have been able to replicate non-targeted dynamics at the product firm level and the portfolio composition of the product firms. We have shown that, in fact, ignoring these product dynamics is quantitatively important from the perspective of welfare and from the perspective of the macro behavior of these models. And we also have shown you that exporting innovation is critical to understand the recovery from these episodes. So that's basically it. And I think that I am on time. Thank you.
Thank you.